Party of the United States of America endorsed Hillary Clinton. So you remember how the media went mad because David Duke, a guy who was in the KKK decades ago briefly, had some positive things to say about Donald Trump? Well, KKK killed about 3,000 people in the entire history of the United States. That's 3,000 too many. Still quite a lot less than an ideology which killed 94 million people. And the head of the Communist Party in the United States endorsed Hillary Clinton. Did you hear anything about this from the mainstream media? Of course not, for reasons we're going to get into in this presentation. So let's talk about the truth about Fidel Castro. So let's just get some reactions from some famous people, shall we? Naomi Campbell said, "Meeting Castro was a dream come true. These are two men, Castro and Nelson Mandela, in the world that I think are an inspiration to everyone. They have fought with integrity to stick to their beliefs. I'm so nervous and flustered because I can't believe that I met him. He's a really, really intelligent person. He said that seeing us in person was very spiritual." All right, Naomi Campbell, not much of an intellectual. Hey, let's go to French existentialist philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre, who, I guess in between threesomes with his graduate students, managed to say, "Castro is at the same time the island, the men, the cattle, and the earth. He is the whole island." Yeah, that's very clarifying. Good thing he was a philosopher. It made things clarifying for people. Norman Mailer, famous American writer who stabbed his wife with a knife, ex-wife with a knife, I think it was at the time, and he said, "Oh, it's okay, man, because as long as it's only a knife, there's still some love left." Lovely guy. He said about Fidel Castro, "The first and greatest hero to appear in the world since the Second World War." Gina Lollobrigida, actress, said, "Castro is an extraordinary man. He is warm and understanding and seems extremely humane." Francis Ford Coppola, I know, I'm sorry, I like The Godfather too. He said, "Fidel, I love you. We both have the same initials. We both have beards. We both have power and want to use it for good purposes." Harry Belafonte said, "Deo, Deo, work all night gunning down counter-revolutionary scum." Oh, actually, sorry, I misread that. He said, "If you believe in freedom, if you believe in justice, if you believe in democracy, you have no choice but to support Fidel Castro." Chevy Chase, the comedian, says, "Socialism works. I think Cuba proves it." Dan Rather said, "Cuba's own Elvis." Oliver Stone said, "Castro is very selfless and moral, one of the world's wisest men." Jack Nicholson said, "A genius." Kevin Costner said, "It was an experience of a lifetime to sit only a few feet away from him." Now, the U.S. State Department, Amnesty International, and Human Rights Watch all listed Fidel Castro's Cuba as among the worst violators of human rights on the planet, while the Committee to Protect Journalists condemns the harassment and imprisonment of journalists. But apparently, a lot of fairly prominent people love him, and the fact that they love him is gross enough, but the fact that they're not facing any negative repercussions for loving him, it tells you everything you need to know about the communist or commie-sympathizing mainstream media, the vile enablers of all things red and collectivist and totalitarian that the 20th century, and to some degree the 21st century, has to offer. Imagine if these people were saying this about Hitler. Hitler being an amateur when it comes to those who enacted communism, who killed 4 times as many people, at least. So, let's talk a little bit about his history. Now, while studying at the University of Havana in April 1948, how do I know 1948? That's right. That's the year that 1984 was finished by George Orwell, nay Eric Blair, and what he did was he flipped 1948 to 1984 to get his year. So, April 1948, Castro participated in the communist-led riots in Bogota, Colombia, which led to thousands of deaths. Less than a decade later, and an estimated 100,000 Colombians had been slaughtered during the period in Colombian history, which would be known as La Violencia. Now, I'm not a native Spanish speaker, but I don't think that means the violet flowers. I think that means the flower of blood. Now, of course, while many 22-year-olds are just starting their adult lives, Castro was getting his revolutionary street cred, his blood juice, and laying the groundwork for his very blood-soaked future. Declassified Soviet documents revealed that Fidel's brother Raul Castro was a reliable KGB contact since at least 1953, prior to the revolution. Now, they will deny any engagement or involvement with the KGB or with Russia or any involvement with communism, but these declassified Soviet documents are revealing quite a bit, along with the fact that McCarthy was largely right. There were hundreds of Soviet spies in the State Department, but we'll do that presentation another time. In June 1955, Ernesto K. Guevara met Raul Castro, who subsequently introduced him to his older brother, and the plot to overthrow the Cuban government of Fulgencio Batista came together. Now, we have a whole presentation, The Truth About Che Guevara, and spoiler, Fidel Castro had Che Guevara killed because Che Guevara had a habit of killing children. Now, interestingly, Fulgencio Batista was a mixed-race grandson of slaves who led the majority-white Cuban population. While 72% of the Cuban population was white, the head of state, minister of agriculture, chief of the army, and president of the Senate were black. So, this was I think, affirmative action kind of government. And you would think, of course, that those who were keen on minority rights or on black rights would have been quite keen on this country and not so keen on its overthrow, but since their mission is to serve communism rather than anything else, you'll see how it came out. So on November 25th, 1956, Fidel Castro, Raul Castro, Che Guevara, and their guerrillas set sail for Cuba, announcing themselves as pro-democracy and anti-communist freedom fighters. Remember this, pro-democracy and anti-communist freedom fighters. How's that going to work out? We got a government program called Liberation. Now, the United States media. Now in its 8th decade of betraying the American dream, the United States media would later explode with stories of bloodbaths and brave guerrilla warriors, but the reality of what happened was, in fact, quite different. The stories of Che Guevara's military exploits are largely fiction, as Castro had figured out a different and more effective way to take over Cuba. In a deal called the Miami Pact, Castro conspired with anti-Batista Cuban politicians and wealthy exiles to acquire a large fund that he later used to bribe military commanders in Batista's army. Having secured their position in Cuba, the guerrillas invited U.S. media and started reporting manufactured stories of their fights with Batista's army. The New York Times. Now, before we get into detail about the New York Times, just wanted to mention the New York Times had a little bit of a history of being a tiny bit on the pro-communist side. So one of its most famous reporters, Walter Duranty, one-legged wonder, he received a Pulitzer Prize in 1932 for a series of reports in the New York Times about how wonderful the Soviet Union was. See, he'd been shown around the Soviet Union in what were called Potemkin villages, where they took people from the concentration camps, fattened them up, and then had them smile at gunpoint to show Duranty and his naivete just how wonderful life was in the Soviet Union. So in June 1931, he published these stories. In 1932, he actually received a Pulitzer Prize for how wonderful his stories were. And he was criticized for the falsehoods and his gullibility in being taken in by Stalin, and he just denied this widespread famine that occurred later in 32 to 33 in the USSR, and particularly the Holodomor, the mass starvation in Ukraine. And there were, of course, calls years later, to revoke his Pulitzer, but even the New York Times said that his articles constituted, quote, some of the worst reporting to appear in this newspaper. Never gave back the Pulitzer. So, New York Times, along with the mainstream media as a whole in the United States, extremely pro-communist in many ways, which is one of the reasons why they attacked McCarthy, who was exposing communist infiltration in the U.S. government, and also, and he did this in conjunction with Richard Nixon, which is why when Richard Nixon became president, the leftist, commie-sympathizing media had to go after Richard Nixon. So, the New York Times